reckon of all these letters, I reckon this is the one when Jesus was dictating his messages that would, of course, be effectively a circular letter. So if you think about that, what that means is not only was this letter working its way around the different churches, but the different churches were able to read the mail going to the other churches as well, right? So in some cases, that's quite awkward in terms of what's being said, yeah? But I reckon as Jesus was dictating this message to the church in Philadelphia, he rather enjoyed it. He rather enjoyed it because it's quite an intimate letter. It's a personal letter. And it's one of the two letters, the other one being to the church in Smyrna, that has no word of complaint or correction to it, okay? So you read the other 5 letters, and there's a sort of sense at times of a bit of a rebuke or a correction or a complaint of something in their church life. But Philadelphia receives no such rebuke, along with Smyrna. You know, the church in Philadelphia hadn't lost its first love. It had remained loyal under pressure. It was a church that wasn't careless and carelessly tolerant of the ideas that might be in their society that was contrary to the gospel. It had been a bold church confessing Jesus in the marketplace. And as we've said, unlike 5 of the other churches, there's no call here to repentance for this church. And instead, Jesus seems to heap praise upon them. And he says that they have in front of them an open door. So if I'm probably more excited than I should be about being able to control this with my mobile phone. So we'll see how we get on as to whether that actually works or not. You can give me marks at the end, but I'm going to read. But why don't you stand with me as we read this passage? So to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I've placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they're not, but are liars, I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have, so that no one will take your crown. The one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on them my new name. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Thank you. If you'd like to take your seat. What a great letter. And you know what we see here, I'm going to give a very kind of simple talk this morning with 3 points. Who is Jesus in this passage, what Jesus sees, and what he promises to the church in Philadelphia. So who is Jesus? What Jesus sees and what he promises to the church in Philadelphia. And what we see here, first of all here, is who is Jesus? We read in verse 7 here that Jesus is presented as the words of him who is holy and true and who holds the key of David. And if you remember, as we've been going through this, often we kind of read this kind of language and we're going, what on earth is that about? What on earth is the key of David, you know? And in fact, I've read lots of different opinions this week on what the key of David could be, actually. There's certainly not a slam dunk opinion amongst those who know what they're talking about as to what it means. But it seems here that Jesus is the one here who, a bit like the steward that we read about, and of course we all know this, don't we? The steward from Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 22. We read there of someone who is a steward, who is appointed over God's house, and he is given what's called the key of David. And what is that? Well, it's like the royal key that can open any door, any lock. Any door in the temple of God can be opened by this key. Why? Well, if you're a king, you get to go where you want to go. You get to go anywhere you like. And so you get the master key. You get the key that opens all the doors. A bit like, I'm sure here at Gordania School, someone somewhere has a master key, don't they? That kind of opens every lock in this place. Well, it here describes that Jesus has the key of David. What is that? Well, it seems to be suggesting here that Jesus is equipped with this regal power, and that Jesus has chosen to open a door right in front of the Philadelphian Christians. And he's urging them to go through that door, a door that only he can open. He says that he's setting an open door before them. Philadelphia, actually, as a place, was described as the doorway to the east. Why was it described as like that? Because Philadelphia, as a city, in its very makeup, in its setup, in its politics, in the way in which it did things, was there to spread Greek and Roman culture eastwards. That was what it was. It was described as the doorway to the east because it was there to spread Greek and Roman culture eastwards into Asia Minor. And here Jesus speaks to the church in Philadelphia and says, actually, I'm opening a door to you. You as a city describe yourselves as a doorway to the east. Well, I'm opening a doorway to you today. And the author Darrell Johnson puts it like this. He says it's an open door. But it's an open door to share the gospel of the open door to all around them. And although in number, this church in Philadelphia was small. It was a small church. It was a persecuted church. Do you remember in the passage it's got this weird phrase? It says, those who are of the synagogue of Satan. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it doesn't sound good, does it? It sounds as if the Jews in Philadelphia are persecuting the Christians here. And these Christians, small though they are, a small church though they are, haven't turned their backs on God. And they've remained faithful to him, even in the midst of some quite severe persecution. And Jesus says here that there's an opportunity not only for this church to stand firm in their faith, but actually to make advances, to walk through a door that he has opened for them, to take the good news of Jesus into places and into hearts that it hasn't yet reached. With the backing of Jesus, they've got everything that they need. He is holy, he is true, and he is the one behind them. So who is Jesus here? He's holy and true. But he's also the one with the key to end all keys, the key that opens every door. And what he's saying to them is, I've opened a doorway for you guys. Take courage and walk through the door that I'm opening up for you. And they have to grasp that opportunity whilst it's still there. And whilst Jesus is still holy and he's still true, what he's saying to them is actually, I am all you need. I am all you need. Step in to this next phase that I've got for you. So that's who Jesus is. He's holy and true, and he's opened for them a door. But what is it that Jesus sees here? What is it he sees? You might have picked up as we were reading there that Jesus speaks to this church, and he uses an old phrase. He says, you who are of little strength. Did you see that? You who are of little strength. And I said at the start of this talk that no words of Jesus here are a rebuke. And sometimes we can kind of hear, you little strength of a church, you. That's not a great nickname to kind of be over a church, is it? A church of little strength. But Jesus isn't issuing a rebuke. He's not even saying that actually them being of little strength as a church is a disadvantage. It seems to be here that what Jesus sees and what we see are often a matter of perspective. What Jesus sees and what we see are often a matter of perspective. I don't know about you, but I think mostly in our culture we despise weakness. At work sometimes we talk about where are our weaknesses as a team. And when we're hiring new people, we use a terrible phrase, let's hire for our weaknesses. You ever heard people say that? Let's hire for our weaknesses. And there's a sense in which that's kind of good, right? What you're trying to do is say, well, what skills haven't we got? Or where are some gaps? And let's make sure that we've got the right people. Why, lo and behold, might we have a weak area in what we do? So let's make sure that we've got the right people. And there's a point to that, I get that. But actually so much in our culture is about trying to paper over the cracks of our weakness, to hide it, or somehow to do something to mitigate for areas in our lives that are weak, because it's not seen as a good thing. I've been sort of really feeling this week, actually, the Lord speaking to me quite clearly on this. And it's actually from this verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I don't know if you've read, I think it's actually 2 Corinthians chapter 12 rather than chapter 3. I don't know if you've read this. And here Paul is there talking about a thorn in his flesh. Do you remember this? If you remember reading in Paul's letters, he talks about how the Lord seems to have given him a thorn in his flesh. And he says this wonderful thing there. He feels the Lord speaking to him. And he says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in... Now, some of you know the answer, don't you? The weakness, because we know it before. But I've just been reflecting this week on the fact that actually, sometimes we read these things, don't we? And they just wash over us. And I wonder, actually, if you were honest and you were completing that sentence, not knowing what that last word is, what word you would put there? So often we think that weakness and power are opposites. And you kind of think, well, what would it look like here? My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in having 2 degrees. How is Jesus' power made perfect in us? Or maybe it's, living a prophetically powerful life where I sort of speak into people's lives, and actually what we see is them connecting with the Holy God. That is what a powerful life would look like. Maybe you're thinking, if only I had my health. If only I had more energy than I do now, then I would be able to live a powerful life in God. If only I was more confident. If only I had that position at work, or earned a bit more, or when the kids are a little bit older than they are now, then I will have a real sense of God's power at work through my life. If only I could escape the situation that I'm in. Perhaps a situation where you feel uncertain for the future. A situation of childlessness. If only my husband were a Christian, then I'd know what it meant for God's power to be at work. Then I'd see what God would do, how I'd be able to serve him if my circumstances were different. And speaking honestly, I think for all of us, we have those areas in our life where we recognize that we have an area of weakness. And sometimes, actually, we might describe them as limitations in our lives. It might be for you a particular circumstance that you find yourself in. It might be your personality type. If I'm really honest, I've spent a decent chunk of my adult life feeling as if my introversion is a disadvantage. Yeah, so I'm an introvert, right? And I know this, right, because I love going on weekends away. I love church weekends away. We've got one coming up, haven't we? And I know because driving home from those weekends away, Ruth, who is perhaps more extroverted, is like buzzing with all the people and all the conversations we've had. You know, I love people. But do you know what? At the end of a weekend away, I want to lie down in the dark room. You know? And if I'm completely honest, I've often looked at that as quite a disadvantage in church ministry and in church leadership. Because you spend a lot of time with people and you spend a lot of time engaging with others. And I look at these extroverts who just kind of like love it and lap it up. And I'm like, oh, I wish I was a bit more like that. But actually, I feel like the Lord's been taking me on a journey with that too. Of actually recognizing that whilst I have some limitations, it's actually God's power that works through those very things that I wish were a bit different. Do you know what I mean? Now, yours might be very different from mine. Perhaps I overthink these things, being an introvert as I am. But actually, I think it's in our limitations and in embracing our limitations that actually we can see God's power at work in a significant way. You know, does that mean that if you've got an opportunity to change circumstances that wouldn't be of your choosing, that you wouldn't do it? No. You know, does that mean that God doesn't want us to look for opportunities for self-improvement or to step outside our comfort zones? Absolutely not. I think all those things are great. But do you know what? I think there's also something here of each of us recognizing that the limitations that are upon our lives are often not the hindrance we think they are to God being at work in and through us. What Jesus sees and what we see are quite different. And you know, the Philadelphian church here had limitations on them. They were of little strength. And I bet they prayed for those limitations to be removed. Yeah, I reckon they did. I reckon they prayed against whoever the synagogue of Satan were. I bet they were praying hard that actually that situation would change. God bless them. But actually what Jesus seems to see here is that there's a wider dynamic at work in these Philadelphian Christians, and he wants them to recognize it. Because he looks at them and says, yeah, you have little strength, but see what I'm doing? I'm opening a door for you. In your circumstances right now, I'm opening a door for you. And what Paul says in Corinthians is also true. And on the same lines, my grace, he said, is sufficient for you. That's what he felt the Lord saying to him. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Not despite of weakness. Not even though you're weak, I'll still be at work. No, my power is perfect in weakness. And Paul here goes on to say, actually, that's why he delights in his weakness. For when I am weak, Paul said, then I am strong. In 2 Corinthians 4, he talks in very similar terms. There was a band in the 90s that had this name, Jars of Clay. Do you remember that? And actually he says, we are like jars of clay, those cracked pots through which the light shines. And what we see here, and Jesus speaking to the Philadelphian church, is that actually God does see our limitations, but he's bigger than them. And what he calls the Philadelphian church to do is to lift their eyes upward, knowing that God can use little old me. God can use little old me. And actually his power can be at work through those things. I was listening recently to someone called Rachel Hughes. She's the wife of Tim Hughes, who we've been singing some of his songs this morning. And she, in her own right, is a wonderful leader, a real strong female leader, leading a church up in Birmingham, and also leads a kind of women's ministry across the UK called The Orchard. It's fantastic. She's got a lot of great things to say. And, I was listening to her on this, and she was saying that actually she's got 5 kids, She's got four natural kids and an adopted child also. And she said, there's been long seasons in her life where she's recognised that for her the right thing to do is to step back from very public leadership and to be a leader in her family, to be a mum and to be there for her kids. And speaking very honestly, she said, at times she's found that really difficult because she's sort of naturally wants to be out there and serving the Lord in quite public ways and has many giftings that point in that direction. But actually, she said, like in choosing for a season to step back from that, in choosing to accept the limitations that are on her life for a season, actually what she's seen there is real fruitfulness in her own personal faith and in the lives of her family. And what she recognised was that even for a season, choosing to embrace those limitations wasn't stepping back from what God was doing. It was stepping into all that God had for her in that part of her life. And I wonder for all of us whether that's true. I think that's true for us personally and individually. I think that's also true for us as a church. We as a church, perhaps we might look at us and go, do you know what? We're not too big. Maybe we're a bit weak, or maybe we're not very impressive. And yet, actually, what Jesus sees is something quite different. He looks with a different perspective. And I think he's calling us as a church to lift up our eyes to what he's doing and where he's at work. I look around the room here, and it may be a fascinating exercise to add up the number of years of faithful love and service to Jesus we've got in this room. It's an incredible asset. To look in this room, to see the number of people who've committed their life to prayer and to intercession for God. To see just how in this room, even over this weekend, as we've seen with the carnival, just the deep roots that we have in our community of Portishead and the surrounding area. And I think when Jesus looks at us and when we look at ourselves, sometimes we kind of look and go, bit here and there, bit iffy. Sometimes we're not quite sure what's going on, what's identity, and actually what Jesus looks at us and sees is he sees, a church with limitations, a set of people with limitations. But actually he doesn't see that as a bad thing. What he sees as an opportunity and a platform for his power to be at work in and through us. So that's who Jesus is, what Jesus sees. What about what Jesus promises to this church in Philadelphia? In verse 9, he says this, I will make them, this synagogue of Satan, I will make them acknowledge that I have loved you. It seems here that Jesus is speaking to this group of people and saying, actually, there will be vindication for what you're experiencing in the here and now. And he speaks his words of protection over them. Verse 10, he says, I will keep you from the hour of trial. Jesus here seems to be promising to keep them, not always from suffering, but keep them safe in him through what they're experiencing. And then in verses 11, 12, and 13, he speaks of their reward. Philadelphia was a place notorious for its earthquakes. Philadelphia had suffered one, in fact, one of the worst it's ever suffered, most likely 50 or so years before this book was written. And much of the city had been destroyed and had been rebuilt with a grant from the then emperor. And so Jesus sees the instability of the city that these Christians are living in, Philadelphia. He sees its geographical position. He sees its cultural instability, and it's a spiritually challenging place for these people to live. And, of course, a physically challenging place for them to live as a volcanic area. And he says, verse 12, that I'm going to make you a pillar. I'm going to make you a pillar and a firm foundation on which my kingdom can be built. Jesus sees the onset of weariness in these Christians, and he asks them to wake up. Waking up in another day of what it seems to be quite a dark city. And he says to them, I'm coming soon. I'm coming soon. It won't be long before they see Jesus face to face. And Jesus here meets them in their pain, meets them in their unmet longings, meets them in their waning hope. And he says, well done. You don't have to wait much longer. It's brilliant words. It's beautiful words. And he says this. Jesus says, you won't have to go out from this place anymore. We sort of think, what? Philadelphia was a city so challenged by volcanoes that when there was a risk of an eruption or seismic activity, people would flee from the city of Philadelphia to be safe into the hills or into the rural areas, and then they would come back again. And that would be quite normal. And so it meant that they'd have rich and fertile soil and hot springs in the area around them, but it meant that they were in constant danger of earthquakes, coming and going from this city constantly. And whenever a quake struck, the people from Philadelphia would flee. And as those aftershocks subsided, they'd go back to the city. That was their experience of life. And Jesus here says to them, there'll come a time when actually my name will rest on you, and you won't be coming back and coming in and out of my city, because I'm building a city that won't be shaken, and it'll be a city for you to live in long term. And he says to them, you'll be a pillar. A pillar is a metaphor, if you like, for strength and support, a metaphor for spiritual maturity. A pillar, I think, is someone in our community who sustains it and who upholds it, who upholds our church community with faithfulness and with character and with prayer. Pillars are people who focus not on looking impressive, but about being there for others. And, I've been reading a great little book called Platforms to Pillars by a guy called Mark Sayers. Well worth listening to or reading. You can listen to it on audiobook or you can read the book. It's a great one. And his main point here is that actually we in our society like to put people on platforms. We like to put people in a position where they have a voice. And whether that's on, Instagram or whatever kind of your social media of choices, we like to put people in a visible place of influence. People with charisma. People with a public persona. And what he argues in this book, really fascinatingly, is that's not what we need. We don't need more people who stand on platforms. What we need is more pillars. More people who will stand firm in faithfulness and care for their community. People who won't look to ask people to look to them, but people who will faithfully serve others. And that is what Jesus speaks to this community. He says, I'm making you a pillar. Not because you're personally impressive, not because I want to put you on a platform, but because of your faithfulness. You're a pillar, upholding your community and caring for those around you. So I wonder this morning, for you and for us as his church, what the Lord might be saying to us. And I think this morning, the Lord is speaking to us about a willingness to see our weaknesses and our limitations through different eyes. Jesus here speaks to this church and says, you have little strength. There's no word of judgment there, because what he sees is in their little strength. He has a platform for his power to be at work. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, quite exciting in the UK right now, I think, actually what we're seeing is God seems to be doing something special. And he seems to be particularly working amongst young men who are coming to faith in great numbers in the UK right now. Did you know that the church is growing for the first time in many decades? now. And it's growing amongst the poorest, it's growing amongst the culturally diverse, and it's growing amongst young men significantly. And I think it's super exciting. And I think this morning the Lord would say to us to raise up our eyes to what he's doing, to lift our sights to what he's up to. And you know, sometimes what we do might not feel shiny or polished. But actually, I think what the Lord would be saying to us today is that actually it's through our limitations that his power can be at work. We've got here a great platform for discipleship. We've got a great platform for standing firm in the faith and being bold, speaking with confidence into our community, speaking with a spiritual maturity into our community that so desperately needs maturity. I think we're well placed to be ambassadors for God's kingdom. And so I wonder this morning, for us as church and for you as an individual, what the Lord would say to you. Why don't we stand?